the rise of Bitcoin, and how do you view, that both like just as a standard engineering phenomenon and also like the impact in terms of the existing systems?
Sure. So if we take a step back and say, why is money broken today? I think a lot of it is that there's been a gap between transaction speeds and settlement speeds that has just arisen because of technology. And so before the invention and adoption of the telegraph, complex information and people moved at like the same speed. Like you couldn't bring a ledger or send a transaction faster than people could go on a ship somewhere and do that. Basically, matter and information were moving at roughly the same speed. But with the invention of the telegraph, which was the 1830s, and then the widespread deployment of it, which really kind of accelerated in the 1860s, that's when you got cross-Atlantic telegraph cables, cross-continental cables. It took a few more decades to get the whole world connected. But basically, you have this system now where information could go at the speed of light, but physical matter still couldn't. And if you can do information, you can do transactions, you can do credit, you can do agreements of various types. And so we started to accelerate global commerce, accelerate how different banks and central banks can communicate with each other. But moving and importantly verifying physical gold couldn't really do that at the same speed. And so basically for the past century and a half, the way we've solved, and really going back even before then, is the way we've solved some of the limitations with money is to increasingly centralize and abstract it. That basically all of our efficiency gains have come at the cost of centralization. Basically saying, well, if we just trust this gigantic ledger to, overlay on top of our gold, and we just kind of update that ledger, then it's super efficient. And of course, when you trust a giant ledger, you're likely to get rug pulled. And of course, that's the history of money over the past century and a half is, gold pegs broke. Eventually they just said, we're not even going to peg ourselves to gold anymore. You're stuck in this inflationary environment. And there's really not much of a fallback method because gold itself is still slow. In order to be a modern money, it has to be abstracted in some way. And what Bitcoin is basically saying, well, here's this ledger. It's roughly as efficient as a central bank, and yet it's decentralized and it's scarce. And there's no single entity that controls it. And it required a lot of work going into that. I mean, basically, from an outside perspective, a lot of people might think that Bitcoin just kind of came out of nowhere, but this was decades in the making by various parties. Like I cited in the early 80s, David Chaum published a paper, I believe at Berkeley, which was basically how mutually non-trusting groups can work together to have a shared ledger or database. And then in the 90s, you had proof of work and other methods of basically creating digital scarcity. But the problem was they were centralized. And what Satoshi did was, given better and better internet bandwidth, better and better encryption methods, and the prior creation of these other big important pieces, he put them together in such a way that says, okay, well, here's digital scarcity combined with decentralization. And that's actually pretty remarkable. It's basically this is the first time where we have the ability to send something that's scarce fast, right? We can update this ledger, and it's not an inflationary ledger. It's not based on ongoing credit. It's not like, if I send you a Bitcoin transaction, that can happen in minutes across an ocean even. And there's nothing I can do to pull that back. There's nothing that someone can really do to take it, unless, of course, they're able to literally capture half of the network hash rate on a sustained basis, which is very costly. And so Bitcoin is the kind of the first way to solve this century and a half problem where transaction speeds and settlement speeds are so divergent. And so either we can't have scarcity, or we have to tie scarcity to credit. And both of those are problems. And this is the first way of doing it without that. And it's basically a profound invention, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and just as a thing that exists to show this is possible. Because I think a lot of people beforehand, and even post Bitcoin, you do see some commentators, and it seems like they just don't understand, like, no, this thing really exists, and you got to make sure. Like, in other words, I think before, a lot of people just assumed that, you could either have a wildcat system where the public couldn't trust the integrity of the money, or you need to have a central authority figure, quote, in charge of the money to ensure its integrity. But this idea of a middle approach where it's, the system is very trustworthy and people can understand that, it's not going to just inflate like crazy and and so forth. And as long as I follow certain protocols, my own money per se is probably going to be pretty safe, and no one's going to be able to take it from me against my will. And yet, there's no group that has to be in charge of that. Well, we got to trust those people, or just this all assumes that the people running the thing are either are both competent and trustworthy, which is what you need to assume if you're going to have central bankers in charge.
Yeah, and what's kind of interesting about Bitcoin is, so I've been basically watching it since 2010, and I've gradually shifted from kind of interested skeptic to highly convicted for it, and thinking it's not only is it a good thing, but it's likely to be ongoing successful. And so in the early phases, I was saying, well, I mean, that's a neat concept, but can anyone just copy it? Can we just have 1,000 different Bitcoins? And so, maybe there's only 21 million Bitcoin, but there could be any number of coins, and they're probably just all going to dilute each other. So that was like my first concern. The other thing is just, are the incentives going to work? Is this thing going to eventually get centralized and captured? Or is it actually a clock that never, it's like he set it in motion and it just kind of goes forever without ever being captured? Is it that well designed? And I think what kind of Bitcoin's price and liquidity is it climbing through that test? Basically, it's had, almost 15 years now of people testing it. How robust is this thing? Is it getting captured or no? Is it workable or no? Can you copy it or no? And money is a network effect good. A lot of economic literature would describe it as like the most saleable good, which is similar to liquidity in the sense that even if someone just copies Bitcoin, it's kind of like trying to copy Facebook. You could theoretically copy all the code and run a parallel Facebook, but your new Facebook is so less valuable because people are already on Facebook. Facebook has the social liquidity that is very hard to move over. And so Bitcoin has people using it, people running nodes, miners mining on it, so it's more secure, more costly to attack. Any attempt to copy Bitcoin basically makes an easier to attack version from the start. So it's just a worse product from the beginning. And so really it's just being tested. It's just, and as it kind of saturates a certain type of liquidity, it can then appeal to higher levels of liquidity. So for example, when Bitcoin had $1,000 a day in trading volume, someone couldn't just ape in with $1 million. When it had $1 million in daily trading volume, someone couldn't just ape in with $1 billion. When it had $1 billion, which now it does, billions per day, you can't just ape in, sovereign scale balance sheets or like big BlackRock scale balance sheets can't just ape into it still. It has to kind of achieve a certain amount of liquidity before it's even on the radar for larger pools of liquidity as being a monetary type of good. And then it's also being tested in the technical sense. Basically, there have been some bugs in the past. Bitcoin has 100% uptime since 2013, well over 99% uptime since inception. There have been occasional undiscovered bugs that get fixed before they ever have a problem. And that's kind of one of the debates now, which is how quickly should Bitcoin change versus how should it ossify? Because it's one of those systems where it is technically upgradable, but it's only upgradable in a distributed way. People have to, you can't just, no entity can just push updates to users. Users have to basically pull updates into themselves in a way that's still backward compatible. And the system's just overall being tested and so far in the process of being monetized and being increasingly useful. And of course, the bigger it gets, the more developer funding goes into it, the more people start up businesses and say, okay, here's this problem, I want to solve it. I want to have this better UX. I want to solve this other problem with Bitcoin. I want to solve this problem for Bitcoin. And so you have an emerging ecosystem, which is pretty powerful.
So I think you anticipated one of your answers, but can you just circle back and say, so one of your initial concerns, you said, I forget what the first one so one of them was, I know the second one was saying, why wouldn't more people just come in and just take over the system? Oh, the first one was to say, with a bunch of copycats, wouldn't that just dilute it? And so is your answer what you just said, that because it has that first mover advantage with the network effects, that's why it's not just that, oh yeah, Bitcoin takes off in popularity, there's going to be 16 million copycats and therefore the whole thing's going to get diluted?
Yeah, it's kind of like saying no matter how many pesos Argentina prints, it doesn't really affect the dollar. It's basically the decentralized version of that, which is that no matter how many Dogecoin exist, it doesn't change the fact that Bitcoin has the security and the depth of liquidity and developer ecosystem and various ways of measuring a network effect that are not present. And importantly, in blockchain money, network effects also make it more secure, right? The more valuable it is, the more costly it is to attack it, to try to do a 51% attack and say capture half of the hash rate and censor it, for example, is harder the more valuable the network is. And so when you clone it, you not only do not have any liquidity, you also lack the security. And so it is a environment where money tends to centralize around one or two. Is that the liquidity pools together in a similar way that social media will pool into some big silos. We're kind of seeing the same thing with these monetary networks.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, everybody, this is Bob Murphy. Thanks for listening to this clip from the InFi podcast. If you like what you heard and want to hear more, please consider subscribing and share this video with others. We've got new episodes dropping every Friday with more insightful discussions. Stay tuned.